Okay, so get this. We're diving into some news about the Russia-Ukraine war.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like there might be a turning point.
Really?
Yeah. So Bloomberg is reporting on this interview with Zelensky on Sky News,
Okay.
and he suggests he's open to a ceasefire.
Oh,
But there's a catch.
okay.
This ceasefire would involve Ukraine giving up land.
Giving up land.
Yeah, territory that Russia already has control of.
Wow.
Yeah, surprising, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, so let's try to understand what this all means. I mean, this is completely different from what we've been hearing from Zelensky
Yeah.
and even Biden.
Uh-huh.
Up to this point, they've both been saying, like, no way we're giving up any land.
Right, not an inch.
Exactly, not an inch of territory. So this interview hints that things might be changing,
It does.
not just for the war, but for global geopolitics, too.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So we really need to break this down and see what the implications are. So, okay, let's start with the basics. What exactly is Zelensky proposing here?
So basically he's saying that Ukraine is willing to have a ceasefire,
Okay.
but in exchange for security guarantees.
Guarantees.
Yeah, for the rest of the Ukrainian territory. He specifically mentioned NATO or the UN stepping in to protect them.
Interesting.
But of course, this means Russia gets to keep what they've already taken.
Which is about, what, like 17%?
Yeah, about 17.8% of Ukraine.
Wow. So basically trading land for peace
Uh,
and hoping someone else will come in to protect them from Russia trying again.
that's a pretty good summary.
But what are the chances that NATO would actually agree to this?
To be honest,
Yeah.
not very likely.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, having NATO forces go up against Russian troops directly on Ukrainian soil, that's a recipe for a much bigger conflict.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
Nobody.
So if not NATO, then what? The UN?
The UN may be sending peacekeepers.
Peacekeepers. Okay, so that's more likely.
It's more plausible, yeah.
But would it really be enough?
Well, it would definitely be less robust than NATO,
Okay.
but they could maybe act as a buffer.
A buff.
Yeah, between Ukraine and Russia, kind of like a DMZ.
Okay, I see.
But how well that would actually work, would they prevent more fighting? That really depends on what they're allowed to do and if both sides cooperate.
Right. Okay, so let's say this ceasefire does happen,
Mm.
and Ukraine does end up giving up this territory. It's not just empty land, right?
No, you're absolutely right.
What are the real-world consequences of just handing this whole region over to Russia?
Well, a big one is the resources.
That's what Russia says.
Yeah, the Donbas region, the part that Russia controls,
Yeah.
it's packed with resources.
Like what kind of resources?
Well, a huge chunk of Ukraine's oil and natural gas comes from there.
How much are we talking?
90%.
90%.
90% of their oil and natural gas production.
That's massive.
It is.
And if they lose control of that,
It'll be a huge blow to their economy, both now and in the future when they're trying to rebuild.
wow. So this idea that Zelensky mentioned
Right.
about maybe negotiating some kind of resource sharing deal with Russia,
Oh, yeah.
it makes a lot more sense now. But could that really work? I mean, sharing resources with the country that just invaded you.
It's hard to imagine. It would be incredibly complicated. And you'd need a ton of trust and goodwill.
Yeah, there's not a lot of that going around right now.
No, not really.
It kind of feels like rewarding Russia for what they did.
And that brings up a whole other set of questions about the bigger picture. What does it mean if Russia wins?
Even if it's just a partial win.
Exactly. Will it make them bolder? Will they try to grab more land in the future? And what does it mean for the rest of the world?
Yeah, this can't just be about Russia and Ukraine.
It's so much bigger than that.
So what about global power dynamics? How could this impact everything?
Well, it could really shake things up.
How so?
Well, for one thing, other authoritarian regimes might get ideas.
Oh, I see.
Like China, Iran, North Korea, they might see this and think, hey, we can get away with this kind of thing too.
And then what happens to organizations like the UN and NATO?
Right, if they're seen as weak or unable to actually protect countries, it could
Yeah.
really damage their credibility.
Okay, so this conflict that seems regional could actually end up reshaping the whole global order.
That's exactly what we need to be thinking about.
We got another article, too. This one's about former President Trump calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Oh, wow.
Do you think there's any connection between these events?
The timing is interesting for sure. Both of these potential ceasefires happening around the same time. It does make you wonder if this is the start of some larger geopolitical shift.
It does.
It's definitely something to watch.
A lot to think about, for sure.
Yeah.
So just from what we've talked about so far, it seems like this ceasefire could have massive consequences. Not just for Ukraine and Russia,
Yeah.
but for everyone.
I think you're absolutely right. This could be a major turning point, and the decisions made over the next few weeks or months, they could have ripple effects for years, maybe even decades.
So where do we go from here? What should we be watching for as this situation unfolds?
Well, I think there are a few key things. How does the international community respond to Zelensky's proposal? Will they seriously consider sending in a UN peacekeeping force? And will there be pressure on Russia to agree to a ceasefire, one where they don't get to keep all this land?
Right, and we can't forget about the economic impact on Ukraine.
Absolutely.
We talked about them losing those vital oil and gas resources.
Hmm.
But even if the war ends, how will this affect their ability to rebuild?
It's a great question. And the economic effects of this war are going to linger for a long time. Years, maybe even decades.
Yeah.
Rebuilding Ukrainian infrastructure and the economy is going to be a monumental task.
It feels like we're just at the beginning of a whole new chapter in this story. The war might be winding down, but the real struggle for Ukraine is just starting.
You're exactly right. The rebuilding, the negotiating, the securing their future, that's all still ahead. And it's not just about Ukraine. The decisions that are made, the agreements, the precedents that are set in the coming weeks and months, they will shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come.
It's a lot to process, for sure.
It is.
But we'll keep digging into all of it as things develop.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's a tough spot for Ukraine. Wanting peace and an end to the fighting makes sense.
Of course.
But giving up land and basically rewarding Russia for what they did, that's a really worrying thought.
Yeah, and it makes you think, what kind of message does this send to other countries? You know, the ones with those big ambitions to expand their territory?
Right.
Does this set a bad example? Like, if you start a war and win, you get to keep the land you took.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. And it's something world leaders are going to have to think about very carefully. If the ceasefire happens and Russia gets to keep that territory, it could embolden other countries to try the same thing.
Right, because they'll think, hey, the international community might just let us get away with it.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier how this could affect global power dynamics. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah.
What kind of shifts could we see if Russia is seen as the winner here, even if it's not a complete victory?
Well, we might see authoritarian regimes banding together more.
Like who?
Think China, Iran, North Korea. They might see this as proof that their aggressive policies work, and it could weaken organizations like the UN and NATO.
If they can't stop this kind of aggression.
Right, if they're seen as ineffective, it could damage their standing in the world.
So this conflict that seems like it's just between two countries could actually have ripple effects that change the whole global order.
That's exactly right. And that's why we can't just look at these events in isolation. We have to see them as part of a bigger interconnected system. We need to understand the chain reactions, the consequences that could happen down the line.
Okay, let's get back to Ukraine for a minute. We talked about losing resources and the economic impact. But what about the people? The human cost of all of this?
Oh, that's a crucial point. And it's something that often gets lost in the bigger picture. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced, they've lost loved ones, their lives have been turned upside down.
And how does this ceasefire affect them? Especially if they have to give up land to the very people who caused this pain.
That's right. For many Ukrainians, that idea is incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible to accept.
So even if the fighting stops, the road to peace and healing in Ukraine is going to be a long one.
Absolutely. And it's not just about political solutions. There needs to be a massive humanitarian effort.
To help the people of Ukraine.
Exactly, to address their physical and psychological needs. Rebuilding buildings is one thing, but rebuilding lives, rebuilding trust, that's a whole other challenge.
So what role does the international community play in this? What kind of support does Ukraine need beyond peacekeepers?
Well, they need a lot more than just financial aid. They need expertise in things like trauma counseling, social work, conflict resolution. The world needs to help Ukrainians process what they've been through, help them rebuild their communities and find a way to move forward.
Even with all the scars from the war.
Yes.
It sounds like an enormous task.
It is, but it's one the world can't ignore. The stakes are too high, not just for Ukraine, but for the stability and security of the whole region.
Let's switch gears for a second and talk about another possible ceasefire.
Okay.
This one's in Gaza. We have this article about former President Trump calling for a ceasefire there.
Oh, interesting.
Does this signal a possible change in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
It's definitely something to watch. Trump getting involved isn't a surprise. But it does add another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation.
Do you think this push for a ceasefire in Gaza is connected to the potential one in Ukraine?
It's hard to say for sure if there is a direct link, But the fact that these two long-running conflicts might be moving towards some kind of resolution, it does make you wonder if something bigger is happening. Maybe a global shift towards de-escalation.
That would be great. But history shows us that peace is fragile.
You're right, especially in places with deep divisions like these. Any peace agreement, whether in Ukraine or Gaza, needs to be carefully put together and implemented to make sure it lasts.
So it's not just about stopping the fighting.
No, you have to address the root causes of the conflict and create ways for people to talk to each other to reconcile, and ultimately to build a future where everyone can live together peacefully.
So we've talked about a lot today.
We have.
Zelensky's ceasefire proposal, what it could mean for the world, and even a possible ceasefire in Gaza.
It's amazing how these things are all connected. Events that seem totally separate. But they can have ripple effects across the globe.
Yeah, it's like one of those domino effects. One thing happens and then it sets off a whole chain reaction.
Exactly.
And it's hard to predict what'll happen.
That's what makes it so important to look at the bigger picture, to understand the global power dynamics at play.
So let's talk about you, the listener. Why should you care about all of this?
Well, in our world, everything is connected. What happens in Ukraine or Gaza, it affects us all in some way.
Oh, so?
Think about it. These events influence the prices we pay for things, the stability of our economy, even our national security.
It's like we're all on this big ship. And the decisions made by the people in charge, they affect everyone on board.
That's a great analogy, and that's why it's so important to stay informed, to think critically about what's happening, and to be ready to adapt to change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last question to think about.
Okay.
If this ceasefire happens in Ukraine, and Russia gets to keep the land they took, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the world?
It's a huge question, and it's one that will shape how we deal with international relations for years to come.
Does it mean that starting a war and winning is the way to get what you want?
Or is this a way to achieve peace, even if it's not perfect, in situations where going back to how things were is impossible?
There are no easy answers, but it's a discussion we need to have.
As a global community, to figure out how to navigate this complex world.
And on that note, we'll leave you to keep exploring these ideas. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those brains working. Until next time, keep diving deep, folks.